Hello everyone, my name is Brandon Hicks with Blender Unleashed, and today I'm going to be walking you through about a 10-minute introduction to how to use Blender, kind of following along the article that you just read. So if you've successfully installed and launched Blender, then you should be seeing something approximately the same as what I'm seeing here on my screen. And what you're first going to see is this Blender splash screen pop up in front of you. To get rid of that, all you need to do is left click somewhere in the screen over here. So now that that's gone, let's get in here and start looking at how we can start selecting some objects. So by default, the cube here is selected on launch. And so what I can do if I want to select another object, such as the camera or this lamp over here, is I can right click on an object, and that's going to turn that object into an orange outline and show me that that is the actively selected object. So right click will select an object. Left click, as you may have read in the article, will change the position of your 3D cursor in the viewport. And at this point, we don't really have to worry about any of that. So if you accidentally left click, don't worry about it. It's just going to put that somewhere else in the 3D viewport, and it's not going to affect anything in a bad way. So right click will select. Now let's talk about how to navigate around the viewport. So the way to get around and rotate in the viewport is that you just use your middle mouse button to click and then drag. That's going to allow you to orbit around the 3D viewport like this. You can also hold shift and middle mouse button drag to pan around the viewport like this. And then you can scroll with your middle mouse button to zoom in and out. And so that's basically how you get around. It's pretty easy. Just remember the middle mouse button does all the work for you. And so now that you know how to get around, let's talk about how to start manipulating this object. So we talked about the cube, we talked about how it's not really that interesting. If we go ahead and hit render right now, you're going to see that using the default Blender renderer right here, it's just going to give us kind of a boring cube. So what can we do to start manipulating this and make it look a little bit more interesting? Well, the first thing we can do is we can look at moving it around. So what you can do is left click on these arrows, and that will drag it around in an axis depending on which axis that you pick. So the blue arrow right here is the Z axis, Y is the green arrow here, and then X is the red arrow. And so that's how you can start moving your objects around in the scene. You can also scale your object by switching the manipulator here from a move to a scale icon down here in the bottom of your 3D viewport right here. And so then that'll allow you to scale along an axis, so you can make it fatter or skinnier. You can also change it to the rotate icon, and that will allow you to rotate your object around any particular axis. So these all work identically. It just changes the operation based on which icon you have selected down here. You can also change the way it transforms. We won't get into this right now, but this will affect the way that all of these behave. And you can also turn your manipulator on or off if you want to get rid of it. So that's something to be aware of. So now that we know how to kind of get our object in place, we can manipulate it. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to use some keyboard shortcuts to speed this up, because I typically don't end up using these icons. I find them a little bit slow to use. So instead what I use are 3 keyboard shortcuts that are really fast and easy to learn, and they make this a little bit faster. So the first thing is the move keyboard shortcut, and that is going to be the G key on your keyboard. So if you hit G and just start moving your mouse around, you'll see that it moves whatever object you have selected around the screen. If you want to scale an object, you can hit the letter S on your keyboard for scale. It's going to scale it globally like that, and then R is for rotate, just like that. So G for move again, R for rotate, and S for scale. And then you can also move it with the G key, and then if you hit the letter X for X-axis, it's going to constrain it to that particular axis. So it's kind of a handy, more accurate way of moving these around. And as you start to rotate your viewport around, you will learn how to rotate these objects into place, scale them, and of course I can scale them on the X-axis just like that. That works really well, and sort of manipulate this cube into place. So now that you know how to do that, let's talk about how to get rid of an object. Let's say we don't want to have a cube anymore. We want to put something else in here. I can select the cube. So let's say I don't have anything selected. If I right click on the cube and select it, I can hit X to delete this. It's going to ask me, do I want to do this? And I hit yes, delete, and now it's gone. Let's say I made a mistake and that's not what I want. I can hit undo, which is Control Z or Command Z on the Mac, and it's just like in any other program that will undo that for us and get the cube back. So let's go ahead and delete it again, hit X, and then click on delete. And then over here, let's talk about how to add some new objects in. So on the tools palette from the reference sheet, you can go down to one tab below that into the create palette. And if I expand this out a little bit to make this a little bigger, you can see that we've got all of these mesh primitives that are in this list that we can add back to the scene. So if we want to add a cube back, we can click this, or we can pick from any of these other options and add one of these back. So one of the most common things you'll see people add in tutorials is a monkey. So I'll go ahead and add the monkey back right here. Now it's going to typically add that back to wherever your 3D cursor is. So this is one of those circumstances where the 3D cursor can be a little bit annoying if you have it way off in the corner of the screen somewhere. So let's go ahead and delete the monkey head, and I'll show you how to fix this. So let's hit X and then delete that. And then you can go ahead and rotate into sort of a top view, left click to put this back in the middle, and then rotate to a side view, try to put that back in the middle. And you can get kind of close, and that's not a bad way to do it, but a really quick way to get your 3D cursor set back to the middle is to use the keyboard shortcut Shift-C, and that will realign your 3D cursor right to the middle, as well as adjust your viewport to be back around the center of the rotation axis of this grid right here. So Shift-C one more time is how that works. So let's say this is off here somewhere in the corner. I hit Shift and then hold down C at the same time. That's going to reposition the 3D cursor and my viewport. So let's go ahead and add the monkey back, and this time it's going to be at the origin where we want it. And so now that we have this object, we can also do the same operations we were just doing, such as scaling it up, rotating it into place. And so let's say we want to kind of rotate this back like this and move it up a little bit. We'll rotate it down to where it's kind of sitting flat on this grid. And let's go ahead and add a plane underneath. So I'll go over to the Create tab again, and I'll select Plane. That's going to put a plane at the very center of our world. And it's a little small, so I want to scale that up. So I'll hit S and just drag my mouse over. Scale it up to about there, left click to accept that, and then we have our ground in place. So now we can right click on the monkey again and try to reposition him. Rotate a little bit this way and a little bit that way, and it's pretty good the way it is. So there we go. So now we've got a different scene set up. Everything's still in the middle, so if we were to render this out right now, it would give us what we had before, except now we're not going to have a cube. We're going to have the monkey head with the lighting applied to that. So if I hit escape to get out of that and back into my 3D viewport, let's see what we can do to make this even a little bit more interesting. So I didn't really like the way that looked. The monkey head is kind of all in shadow. It's kind of hard to see, so I want to rotate him a little bit, but I can't really see what I'm doing. So what I need to do is be able to look through the eyes of the camera. So what I can do is go down to this view menu, and then if I go up a couple of steps to this camera option here, that's going to let me view through the eyes of the camera. And so that'll take me right into that. Now, as soon as I start to move around again in the 3D viewport, it's going to take me back out of the camera. So I'm not actually inside manipulating the camera, I'm just looking through the eyes. So I can't change the position by doing that, but it gives me a preview of what my render is going to look like. So let's do that again. Go to the view menu, go to camera, and you don't have to have the camera selected to do this, just so you know. So now that I'm in this viewport, I can kind of zoom in a little bit and see that this is the framing for my render. So if I were to render right now, you can see this is exactly the same sort of viewport render that we have when we look through the eyes of the camera. So let's rotate the monkey a little bit. I'll hit R, and I want to rotate around the Z axis. So I'll hit Z, and then I'll just kind of turn my mouse a little bit to get it to point the other way. Left click to accept that, and then let's render this again and see how this looks. That's a little better. I can see the face of the monkey, and I'm a little more happy with that. So let's say we have one object, we have a monkey, we have a plane, but it's still kind of boring, and I wanted to get some more objects in there. So what I can do is I can keep adding objects, as we've seen over here, or I can try to duplicate this monkey so that we have several of them around the scene. And so let's rotate back out into the 3D viewport using our middle mouse button. And I'm going to scale the plane up a little bit more because it was still a little small. I could see the edges in the 3D viewport. Let's go back to the camera view right here. And yeah, you can see that the orange line right here is the outline of the plane. It's a little small, so let's hit S and then drag away from the center to scale that up till it's outside the camera. So that's good. And now when we render, we're not going to see the edges of the plane. Okay, so back to duplicating objects. All you have to do to duplicate an object is right-click to select it, and then you can go to this object menu down here and choose duplicate, or you can use the keyboard shortcut right here, which is Shift D. So if I hit Shift D and start dragging away from that object, it's going to duplicate the object, and when I left click to accept that, it's going to put it somewhere in my scene. So I'll get rid of that one more time by hitting X and then choosing delete. And let's try that again. Now this time what I'm going to do is as soon as I hit Shift D, select this, hit Shift D, I'm not going to move my mouse yet. I'm going to leave that right where it is. And instead I'm going to hit X to keep it on the X axis. So it's moving the object as soon as it duplicates it. So if I hit X like this and move it out of the way a little bit, it's going to keep it on the ground and just move it along the X axis. Now I didn't get quite far enough over, so I'm going to hit G to move it again, and then I'm going to hit X to constrain it again, and then it's going to keep it on the ground and move it along the X axis. So now we have this over here. Now let's constrain it to the Y axis. I can drag the arrow, or I can hit G and then Y to move it over, and it's still stuck to the ground because I'm moving along the X and the Y axes. Or I can hit G, X again to move it back a little bit, and now they're going to be side by side. So let's look through the eyes of the camera. Now instead of going back to the view menu and selecting camera, I'm just going to use this keyboard shortcut over here, which is the number pad 0. So on the far right of your keyboard, if you have a number pad, you should be able to hit the number 0, and it will always put you into the camera that's in your scene, and whichever camera is the camera that's active is going to put you into that camera. So there we go. Now we can look through the eyes of our camera and see what this is going to look like. And let's kind of move this over a little bit more so it's a little bit more interesting, something like that. And then from the camera viewport, as long as I don't move, I can still manipulate these objects. So if I hit Shift D again to duplicate this monkey head, I can constrain it to the X axis by hitting X and dragging. Left click to accept that, and now I want to move this over so that it's a little bit in front. So I have 3 monkeys kind of in a row here. A little bit like that. Now they're all kind of on the ground, but they're all kind of in a row. So let's hit render and see what that looks like. Okay, not bad. A little bit interesting. And I can just keep doing this. I can just keep putting objects into the scene, moving them around, changing them. Some of them I can make really small. Some of them I can make bigger, like this. And it's all just based on your taste and kind of what you want to do for your scene. But this is how you can get in here and start actually manipulating these objects around and kind of making some things look a little bit more interesting. So now that we know how to get around, add some objects, and manipulate them and duplicate them, let's take a look at a few other things that will allow us to make this even more interesting. So we're going to look at changing these objects by their properties. So far we've done a lot of physical things to these objects, but these objects have more characteristics than just the size and the rotation and the placement. Let's say they have, the materials and things like that. So what we're going to do instead of manipulating the objects themselves is we're going to manipulate this light or this lamp because we haven't actually done anything with it yet. So if we move the lamp around, we can actually get a completely different kind of lighting. So right now, it's really high and above our monkey heads. If we move it down low using the same commands we've just learned, we can move it down here close to the ground. Let's look back through our camera to see how that looks and then hit render. And now you can see we get totally different kind of lighting. But we could also duplicate the lamp and get even more lighting into the scene. That's going to eliminate some of these really harsh shadows in the background. So let's try that. Let's duplicate the lamp, Shift D, and I'll click the X key on the keyboard. Move it back here, and now let's render this. There we go. So we got another lamp in the scene to kind of give us a little bit more interesting lighting. And we could do this using sort of a small 3-point lighting setup. So if we want to move this over here, we could duplicate this again and get 3 lights going. And that's going to give us a little bit more coverage as far as what's being illuminated in the scene. So let's hit render now and see what that's looking like. And yeah, it kind of does a little bit better job defining the forms and the volumes in the scene. So These lamps are cool, but they're all grayscale, black and white. They're just white lamps, and there's not materials yet, so it's kind of boring. So let's go in here and change some of the colors in these lamps. So let's grab this one. Now I'm going to jump into my properties window, and now we're going to start manipulating some of the actual characteristics of this lamp. So I just need to go over from the render menu and find the lamp menu right here. So let's click that. It's going to tell me what the lamp name is, and then it's going to give me all the properties related to this lamp. So what I can do immediately right here is I can choose which color I want to use for this lamp. So right now it's white. Let's say we have more of a yellowish kind of bulb. We can just drag this color over to here. And now when we render, switch back to the render menu, hit this render button, you can see that we have a yellow color. So it's that easy. You basically just go through, select the object you want to work on, go over to the properties for that object, and then start manipulating things. So we can make this a little bit more in the blue range over here. Let's try to render that again. And there we go. So you can see we get a little bit more dynamic feel here. And you'll notice as you go through and start playing around that you can tweak all kinds of different things. You can change the type of lamps that you're using. You can change the energy in terms of how bright the lamp is, all sorts of things about the shadows and the kind of samples, things like that. So I will encourage you to get in here and play around as much as you possibly can with all of these objects. Don't be afraid to mess anything up. You're not going to break anything. Just get in here when you first get started. Use these few little commands you've learned to get around the scene, and that's going to help you out a lot when you first get started. So one last thing I want to leave you with before we jump out of this tutorial is how to kind of move the windows around in the panels when you start getting into Blender and playing around. Sometimes you don't want the default layout to be the way it is. Sometimes you want to play around with things. And so what you can do with any of these panels that have an outline with black right here is you'll see the icon change to a split icon like this, and that will mean that you can left click and drag to change the size of this panel. You can do the same thing here, just like that. You can also create new panels. If you go to the upper right hand corner of any of these panels, you'll see these three little lines that looks like a little bit of a grip. This will change into a crosshair, and if you left click and drag now, it's going to split this window in half for you. And so that's really handy. You can do this as many times as you want if you want to keep creating windows. And I'm dragging to the left so that it continues to split this window vertically. You can also drag down to split this window horizontally. And so let's say I have split the windows up, but now I want to get rid of one. It's really simple. All you have to do is go back to this corner that you're using to split the windows, and instead what you do, instead of dragging down into the window, is you drag up over the border of another window to collapse it. So I can't collapse to the right here because I have this split window in half, but I can collapse up. So if I go up, you'll see the arrow pointing up, which tells me which direction it's going to collapse to. So if I let go right now with my left mouse button, it's going to collapse that upward window. And now, since I have one straight vertical bar right here, I can then collapse these windows back to the right. So let's start over here. I can left click, cross over the border, and drag to the right to collapse this. And then if I expand this, you'll see that we actually have another 3D viewport over here. Now these are just duplicates of the same 3D viewport. So I can pick a view here and then pick a view here, and it's the same information. It's just that it's allowing me to see them from different views. And so this is really handy if you want to have a bunch of different setups. You don't want to have to scroll around the screen all the time. This is why you would end up doing this, in case you're wondering. So now that we have these two left, I'm going to show you one more thing you can do, which is if I were to cross over and try to collapse to the right, I can also, while I'm still holding my left mouse button down, cross back over to the left, and it will change the direction in which the screen collapses. So if I cross to the right and then back to the left, then let go, it's going to collapse from the right-hand 3D viewport back to the left-hand 3D viewport. So that's how you can kind of create and uncreate windows inside of your 3D viewport. This does work and inside any of the panels that you see here, as long as you see this little grip icon. So over here, we don't have them in the upper right-hand corners, but we do have them over here. So I could drag this down to create another window, just like that. And let's drag back up to get rid of it. Okay. And so one more thing to be aware of is that every single panel that you see has a little icon at the bottom that dictates which panel is being shown on your screen. And so the 3D viewport is shown right here. I could also jump over to any of these windows, find the little icon, and change this to another viewport. So let's say in a 3D viewport, I want to change this to something to work on, let's say animation. I can change to the graph editor, and that's going to change this to something that kind of resembles the timeline. I could change this to node editor to work on nodes or textures. I could change this to user preferences and go through all my user preferences. And so any window that you see or panel that you see that has an icon like this can be altered to change into something that you need to use. So you can completely go in and customize your layouts. And you also have some presets up here that we talked about in the article where you have your 3 viewports defined for specific kinds of work. So you can go to the 3D view full, so you get rid of all the windows, go to animation to work on animation, and you'll see that these are really handy depending on what you're working on to kind of get a feel for how the layouts can be laid out. So if you want to go back to the default layout, just click this and go to the default, and that'll put you right back to the original. Okay, so now that you have a feel for how to get around and work in Blender, I hope you've learned a little bit. I would really encourage you to get in here and start looking around the menus, start poking around, use the article for reference, and then try to go out here and do something on your own, create some objects, move them around, scale them, change some properties, and just play around and see what you can learn. And then when you're ready to come back and learn some more, come back and leave a comment, let me know how you're doing, and let's get into Blender and we can keep learning together. So this is Brandon Hicks with Blender Unleashed. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.